It's 14 minutes past 8. In the 1970s, 10% of Britain's national output was produced by nationalised companies. Then Conservative governments in the 80s and 90s privatised most of it. And if Labour wins the next election, it said it will put a lot of it back in public hands. And opinion polls suggest a lot of support for the policy. Around 60% of voters, for example, favour nationalising water companies and the railways. But how would it work exactly? And what are the chances that shareholders in those companies will end up shortchanged? This programme understands that Labour's not planning to give shareholders the full market value for their shares, and the judgment of how much compensation they'll get will depend in part on how those companies have behaved since privatisation, how much they've invested, how much debt they've taken on, which I imagine is going to be controversial at best in the City of London. Well, to discuss this, we have Kat Hobbs, the founder of We Own It, which describes itself as a voice for public service users and is a strong proponent of public ownership, and Paul Massara, who's the former chief executive of RWE Npower and who now runs the solar power company North Star Solar. Thank you both for joining us.
Good morning.
Thank you.
I mean, Kat Hobbs, I guess a question for you. I mean, if you seize firms from private shareholders and you don't even give them the market value of the shares, aren't you sending a message that no one should really invest anything in Britain again?
Well, I think what we've seen is 30 years of the failures of privatisation, and shareholders haven't really invested the way that we might have expected. So, for example, if you look at the water company shareholders, they've not actually increased their investment since 1989. They've built up a debt mountain. They started out with zero debt. They've built up a huge debt mountain, and they've taken out profits of 12% every year. So they've had a great deal. Now, of course, we want private companies to be part of the economy. That's fine. But at the moment, our public services are really important, and yet we're being ripped off on a massive scale.
But if my pension, for example, might be invested in one of these firms, I'm not responsible for that lack of investment or any of that, or how much the company's executives were paid or any of that. All I'm going to know is that I'm not getting the value of my shares, that actually the government's taking it off me at a bargain price.
Yeah, so you would be given government bonds to replace your share. But I think we have to look at the big picture.
But not necessarily
here.
The market value, what I think I have in my pension fund.
That's right. But do these shareholders really deserve the market value? Because what we've seen is that water prices, for example, have gone up by 40% in real terms since privatisation. And for energy companies, they've been overcharging us by around 7 billion. So we have to look at the big picture, because yes, if you think about your individual share, that's an issue. But on balance, overall, we're all being ripped off in three ways by private companies. First of all, we're all paying towards those shareholder profits. Secondly, we're all paying towards the higher cost of borrowing, because if we had these public assets in public hands, it would actually be cheaper for government to borrow, so investment would be cheaper. And thirdly, we're all paying for regulating this so-called market, when actually there isn't really a choice. There isn't really much of a market, especially in water and rail. You know, you don't get a choice about where your water comes from or which train you get on. And yet these companies are creaming off profits and making a killing.
But we can get to the arguments about whether these can be better run or whether they're run well now in a minute. But I think just on this question of transfer, I mean, if the rationale is just to run it better and give a better deal to the public, why do you need this element of punishment? Why can't you just give people the value of their shares and say, now we're starting afresh with public ownership?
So I don't think it's about punishment. I think it's about giving back the value. It sounds like
punishment. You're saying you didn't invest enough. At least it didn't invest enough, this company that you've ended up with holding the shares in. And sorry, it's just you're unlucky. You happen to hold them right now and we're going to punish you.
Well, no, it wouldn't be punishment. So in the case of water, for example, it would be that you would compensate the shareholders for the money that they've put in. But the market value of the shares is much, much higher. And that's simply because those shareholders are getting such a good deal. So you'd compensate them for the money that they've put in, and that's fair. But what you wouldn't do is compensate them for the full market value.
Paul Massara, I mean, you have to look at some of these monopolies and say they have not given the customers a fair deal, and some change has got to happen.
I think there's a difference between saying what is the ethos of privatisation, where I believe that companies tend to be run more efficiently in the private sector. They're open to competitive pressures, and they've got the ability to attract the best possible management. They're not capped by things such as the public pay cap. However, I think there are natural monopolies, and where you have natural monopolies, you need to have effective regulation. And I would question and say that there are issues whereby the result in the last few years where you've had quantitative easing, which has allowed interest rates to fall very, very to low levels, has allowed the different capital structures of some of these monopolated companies to effectively leverage the balance sheet and get excess returns. But that's an issue of regulation. I think if you stray into the area to say, actually, we're going to now change the rules on shareholders and somehow punish them, then that sends a whole different signal to investment in the UK, and especially in a post-Brexit world where we're looking to become trading.
In principle, public ownership is not something to be scared of. We see it across Europe in just these sectors. In fact, some of them then buy shares in our own companies.
But I would question about whether those are as efficiently run as actually many of the companies that are actually open to the competitive pressures of the marketplace. Often they have actually subsidies from the government, and actually there's huge levels of bureaucracy and huge levels of inefficiency which are hidden because they're run effectively by the shareholders of the government. And there's lots of records to show that the government aren't the best shareholders of things.
Paul Massara and Kat Hobbs, sorry, I have to leave it there. We will be hearing more, I think, in the coming weeks about what Labour actually plans to do in this area.